It's been about 6 months since 8.0 and the release of the aircraft carrier rework. Half a year, and I think that's plenty of time to have a very hard look at a very uneasy topic. Was the rework worth it? I'm going to delicately give you my thoughts on it. And I mean delicately because of how controversial carriers are. Delicately because of the players that like them, delicately because of the players that don't, and delicately because of the wargaming employees that put an enormous amount of time and effort into the rework. My initial thoughts of the carrier rework aren't that hard to find. Most will remember me stating that it saved World of Warships. That comment didn't age well, did it? To be fair though, the deeper point I was trying to get at was that it rejuvenated the game for myself. That's neither here nor there though. Because once you make a claim like that, whether literally or figuratively, you draw a line in the sand, and you paint a target on yourself. In principle, I think the carrier rework was a good idea. In principle. Wargaming obviously thought it was a good idea. They wouldn't have gone forth with it if they didn't. I'm going to steal a quote from Jurassic Park right now. Your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think if they should. Remove scientists and replace with wargaming. And this right here is the crux of the issue, and an unfortunate continuing theme within some of the decisions wargaming has made. And I don't want this to seem like a bad thing. I think many appreciate innovation and new ideas. It's totally awesome that a game company is willing to look at an entire gameplay of a certain class and 5 years later completely change it to make it more approachable for more players. Few games are willing to do something like that. It takes guts, imagination, and so forth. The first major question though is, did we need the rework in the first place? This is tough to answer. From wargaming's viewpoint, yes, we did. Few players were playing aircraft carriers. The ones that played them regularly had become so good at them they could single-handedly influence battle when pitted against even an average CV player. It was more of a skill gap issue than a gameplay issue, though the gameplay was looked at as the reason more players weren't playing or even getting better. So from wargaming's viewpoint, one class was essentially dead. Yes, it needed to be reworked. From a player viewpoint though, I don't think anyone cared by early 2018 when the first rumbles of a rework were leaking out. Sure, it'd be nice, but carriers were at this point an occasional nuisance. Nothing more. A 1 in every 10 round nuisance. So I won't say players didn't think it wasn't needed. I just don't think players cared enough about the class to see it change. Going back though to wargaming making big changes, which is cool, wargaming also has a knack for thinking up and trying to implement ideas that might sound cool, but the player base winds up hating the general idea of. NTC/Paragon is a huge recent example of this. Wargaming no doubt had all the best intentions in the world for NTC. The idea at its heart wasn't bad, but the rewards were just a horrible idea. If Wargaming had spent time to canvass some of the community with their ideas regarding NTC, they would have found out quickly it wasn't a good idea. Now I'm not going to accuse them of not doing their homework with carrier rework. I can't answer whether or not they canvassed a large or even small portion of the community requesting feedback on the idea of the carrier rework. What I can comment on is the playtesting. I was a part of it. And this leads us to the next point of contention and probably the largest single point of failure of the rework. Implementation. Wargaming put themselves in a very hard position with the rework. They had to implement something that could only be tested wide scale on test servers, which in many ways is a closed environment. Because of this, everything about the carrier rework was a tad off. Huge issues with AA interaction, some weapons being overpowered, etc. You know all of this though. Not to mention the biggest issue, which was the near complete neutering of destroyers. These were all unforeseen circumstances, issues that only arised and could only be seen after going live, and the backlash was swift and loud. At its implementation, the player base was pretty much split 50-50 with very little in between. You either loved the carrier rework or you hated it. And the anger wasn't just directed towards wargaming. Players turned on each other. And that's never a good thing for community building. In fact, for a few rough weeks, it tore the community down. The response and answer from wargaming was to include a myriad of hot fixes, some that we're still seeing, and a pendulum that keeps swinging back between too weak and too strong. Things are closer to where they need to be, but they're still not there. In its current state, carriers, while numerous at first, are slowly dropping off. I know Wargaming has stats on this, and they can state otherwise if they want. That's fine. This is solely in my experience and viewpoint. At this point, the only rounds I have CVs in are usually the rounds in which I decide to play as a CV. We're slowly getting back to that 1 in 10 rounds with a CV. Though right now it's probably closer to 1 in 5 from what I can see. So, was it worth it? I can't definitively answer that with a yes or no. I can only tell you if I were the one in charge, whether or not I would have done it using 20/20 hindsight and a crystal ball. I probably would have left it alone based on what has happened. No, I'm not talking about the players that supposedly left. I don't think quite as many quit as the naysayers would like you to believe. There was drop-off, but nothing that couldn't easily be regained. Really, it's the effect that it had on the community, or at least half the community. Well, not even half the entire community, half the vocal community, which is a much smaller percentage. The optics just aren't good, and they won't be until carriers are right where they need to be, which could take several more months, a year, or who even knows at this point. And given now that carriers are becoming much less used, and you're seeing fewer, this goes against the main purpose of the rework in the first place, which was partly to make them more prevalent and easier to play among the player base. Or at least I thought that's partly why it was done, along with eliminating the skill gap, which is slowly creeping back. Another issue is Wargaming already has a perceived credibility issue among some players. There's deep-seated mistrust, and in some cases hatred, which I'll never understand. This has only given those players more fuel, an aha moment. I told you so. And this is unfortunate. It's unfortunate because, again, at its base, the carrier rework was a good idea. It was to make more exciting gameplay and make carriers more approachable. For many players, it was indeed a success. Maybe even for 50%. Maybe even for more. It's really hard to quantify right now. But at what cost was it a success for those 50% of players? Was the cost the other 50% of players that didn't like the rework? That would make it a zero sum, a wash, an investment that yields exactly what you put into it. Looking at the rework through this context, it makes less sense. But again, hindsight is 20/20. I don't think the players or even Wargaming knew what was going to happen. And that's a problem in of its own, at least on the Wargaming side. And it's also a danger inherent to innovation. So I won't fault them for wanting to go through with it, though I can't really congratulate them either, because the rework isn't complete. And all of this is moot at this point, because they're not going anywhere. Time and money was spent, and this is what we have. And I suspect, slowly, CVs will be about as prevalent as they were prior to the rework in the future. I hope not, I really don't, because the developers put a lot of work into this. And really, it's not that bad in my opinion. But, optics, again. So I guess we'll have to wait and see what happens. Anyhow, I'm interested to hear your thoughts. I tried to keep this as honest and balanced as possible, but that doesn't mean you have to. Let it out, for or against, in the comments. What do you think? In the end, was it worth it? Was it the right decision? Have a good one. Zoop out.